When Maserati builds a new convertible, you can expect more than just a convertible.
You know when a dog's doing its number twos?
The dream, to unite the forefront of automotive technology with the heritage of elegant British coachwork.
That kind of arched back thing.
What do all of these cars have in common?
It's the exclusive new V8 6.4 fuel injection.
The designers of these cars had high hopes and high expectations.
Holy shit.
Instead, these automakers have likely all tried to forget these abominations ever happened.
Imagine a world-class road car with Cadillac comfort.
Here are 10 of the worst sales flops for luxury and sports cars from the 80s to mid-2000s.
That's what it is! Hideous! Ugh.
By the way, this isn't a complete list. There are definitely more cars that could be added. I plan to eventually have a follow-up episode, as well as lists of other types of cars, not just sports cars and luxury cars, which were dismal failures. Be sure to add your suggestions for cars to include in future lists in the comments.
The new Alante!
Number 10, Cadillac Alante. If you saw my recent episode on the Cadillac CTS, you know that car is a great example of GM taking a huge risk at completely reworking their entire Cadillac lineup, with the CTS as a starting point, and that gamble paid off, big time. But they've also taken other very costly risks that didn't pay off, and the biggest, in my opinion, was the Alante. Cadillac's general manager in 1982, Bob Berger, decided they needed a new halo car, a roadster that could compete with the likes of the Mercedes 380 SL and the Jaguar XJS. His idea was to send a group of engineers to Italy to meet with Pininfarina, the coach builder who provided timeless designs for Ferrari, and form a joint venture to build a new roadster for Cadillac. Launched in 1986, the end result was bigger than any other Cadillac project up to that point, by having Pininfarina build the Alante's body in a dedicated factory for Cadillac in Turin, Italy, and then ship the completed bodies in specially designed 747s across the Atlantic to Detroit to complete the assembly. Known then as the longest assembly line in the world, the Alante's platform wasn't shared with any other GM vehicle, something GM rarely did back then. Performance took a back seat to the prestige of its Italian design, resulting in its 4.1-liter V8 needing 10 seconds to reach 60 miles per hour, and an all-electronic dashboard that was more of a gimmick than anything else. Customers were paying what would be in today's dollars over $130,000, by far the most expensive car in Cadillac's lineup. Although critical response was positive, sales were dismal, no thanks to the weak engine, its typical 80s square body design,
Alante turns the wind into a whisper.
and a convertible soft top that not only had to be manually operated, but was prone to significant leaks that Cadillac did little to correct. Improvements were made to the car each year, eventually leading to its highest performance Northstar engine for the 1993 model year that made 290 horsepower. Yet despite a facelifted model planned for 1994, the Alante never met its sales goal of 6,000 per year. After losing so much on the cross-Atlantic trips, GM cut their losses and quietly discontinued the Alante in 1993.
Lantos! Aluminum! Kelly!
Today, some used Alantes can cost as little as $5,000, but don't mention that to its small but dedicated fan club. Number 9, 1980 Chevrolet Corvette 305 California. As I was researching cars for this list, admittedly the last car I expected to include was a Corvette, but this particular Corvette was special, and not in a good way. The Chevrolet Corvette, in its 11th year of its C3 generation, was in the midst of what many consider the worst Corvettes ever made, being sports cars in name only, no thanks to the ongoing gas crisis that severely limited engine displacement. By 1980, the crisis was reaching its peak, especially in California, which had, and still has today, the strictest emission requirements in the nation. GM had already made changes for 1980 to several of the Corvette's body panels to make them lighter, and in every state except California, the V8 engine's displacement was reduced to a 350 cubic inch 5.7-liter V8 that only made 190 horsepower. But at least in those other 49 states, you could still opt for a manual transmission, which helped squeeze out every last one of those 190 horses. But in California, only a 305 cubic inch V8 was offered, making 10 less horses, and only with an automatic transmission, as the auto was able to be tuned to improve the emissions over the manual. If there had ever been a car that could be awarded the title of most eligible for an engine upgrade, the 1980 305 Corvette California is definitely in contention for the top spot. Number 8, Chrysler Crossfire. I included this car in this list simply because it best embodies the biggest mistake, in my opinion, that Chrysler ever made.
Can inspiration make the simple act of driving around extraordinary?
Its so-called merger of equals with Daimler-Benz that began in 1998 and ended less than 10 years later, shortly before Chrysler's second bankruptcy. First revealed as a concept to the public at the North American International Auto Show in Detroit in January of 2001. The Crossfire was the Chrysler brand's first sports car and would share a platform with a Mercedes model, specifically the SLK 320. In total, almost 40% of the Crossfire components would be from Mercedes, and the car itself would be built by their subsidiary Karmann in Germany, as Daimler simply didn't trust American workmanship. As is typical for concept cars, many of the expensive parts and materials didn't make it into production. Its most distinguishing trait, its boat-tail rear end, was controversial, to say the least, and definitely had its critics, with some comparing it to the AMC Marlin. Yet it still managed sales of 35,700 in its first year, an impressive number for a two-seater. Much of the design backlash was quieted down the following year when the Crossfire Roadster was released.
It's the all-American Roadster,
which provided a more traditional trunk design.
apart from the bits that are German.
Soon after was the release of the SRT6 model, which had its Daimler V6 upgraded to Mercedes AMG spec with the addition of a supercharger that bumped horsepower from 215 to 330 and could do 0 to 60 in 4.8 seconds. Yet despite the inclusion of the Roadster and SRT6 models, sales continued to fall each year, so much so that by 2007, it only managed sales of around 2,000 units. By this point, the collaboration between Daimler and Chrysler had collapsed, and Daimler was looking to offload what they considered a failed subsidiary, far away from their promise of a merger of equals. Although there was a 2008 model year, production ended in December of 2007. Daimler had already sold Chrysler to Cerberus Capital Management in April that year, ending what had once been the largest automotive company merger. And except for die-hard fans of the SRT6 models, the Crossfire has largely disappeared from America's roads.
Jeremy famously said that the coupe version of this car looked like a dog parking its breakfast.
Number 7. Sterling 825 and 827. One of my earliest My Old Car episodes was about this car, and at the time I did the episode because I had gotten several requests for it, and I also remembered the car from the 1980s, and always wondered why it seemed to just disappear on American roads, almost as quickly as it arrived. The Sterling was a new make from British automaker Rover, who had, prior to the launch of the Sterling in 1987, made 2 unsuccessful attempts at selling their Rover models in the US. Those failures were 2 different generations of the Rover 3500, whose reputation for build quality was so poor that it even made American build quality of the 70s appear downright impressive by comparison.
That's quite a big panel gap you've got there.
That is quite a gap.
The saving grace for the new Sterling model, or so Rover had hoped, was that it really wasn't a Rover at all. It was a rebadged Honda, sold as the Acura Legend in the US. The name Sterling was an attempt to distance themselves from the poor reputation Rover had in America before, and they made no attempt to hide the fact that most of the mechanicals were Japanese. Unfortunately, their debut model, the 825, wasn't built in Japan, but instead in England, and the same poor workmanship that plagued previous Rovers just continued with the 825 they exported to the US. An improved engine with increased displacement prompted a name change to the 827 in 1989, but the related Acura Legend, built in Japan, outsold the Sterling by nearly 8-1. Creating a special Oxford edition with extra luxury amenities, including a built-in cell phone, did little to improve sales.
No, it's not a payphone. It's a portable phone.
When sales dwindled to 2,700 units for 1991, Rover pulled the plug that year and has never sold a car in the US since. Number 6. Chevrolet SSR. So I'm probably going to get some hate mail for including this one, as I know there are some seriously dedicated fans of this car. The SSR was following a popular trend at the time, to take a retro car style and put a modern spin on it. Other retro-style cars tended to use a specific older model as their inspiration. However, the SSR's inspiration was, well, I'm not really sure, as convertible pickups simply didn't exist back in the era of hot rods. But clearly the designers behind the SSR didn't think that little detail mattered. Initially shown as a concept at the 2000 Detroit Auto Show, with a 6-liter V8 from a 3/4-ton Silverado pickup, it promised to have something that hot rods of the past typically didn't have, practicality, thanks to having a truck bed. But the production version that was available to the public in 2003 had a smaller 5.3-liter V8 that made 300 horsepower, leading to a 0 to 60 time of almost 8 seconds.
Well, it's certainly no spring chicken, more like a spring onion. It stinks.
But I think they counted on many potential owners to not care about that, and instead want the very unique convertible hardtop, which split into 2 pieces and slid between the cab and the bed. Sadly, that roof was prone to breakdowns, and when that roof inevitably fails, finding someone today who can fix it may be a challenge. Only 9,000 were sold for 2003, and sales dropped each year. The starting price of $42,000 definitely didn't help for a car that lacked the performance the concept had promised. The lack of sales led to several weeks of layoffs at the Lansing Craft Center where it was built, which, by the way, first opened with the ill-fated Buick Reatta a couple decades earlier. In 2005, responding to the critics who were unimpressed by the SSR's lack of power, that year the V8 was upgraded to a 6-liter unit making 390 horsepower, which was great for new buyers, but effectively screwed existing owners of the older, less powerful model, as their car's value, not surprisingly, plummeted. After around 24,000 sold, production ended in March of 2006, and the Lansing Craft Center was demolished soon after. Admittedly, the car's popularity has increased since then, I think mostly because of how absurd it is, and some people like weird cars, which I totally get. Number 5. 1981 Cadillac V8 6.4. So for this entry, I'm not picking a specific model, but instead the entire range of Cadillacs that were available for sale for the 1981 model year. That year, the Fleetwood, the Eldorado, and the DeVille all came standard and optional for the Seville, with a new engine design that Cadillac touted as being an ingenious solution to the country's ongoing gas crisis. The engine was officially called the L62, but marketed as the V8 6.4, an existing Cadillac V8 engine which had been modified to electronically shut down 2 or 4 of its cylinders to help save fuel. The Cadillacs would use, in their words, state-of-the-art computer processing power to decide on when the conditions were right to activate solenoids that would prevent the camshaft from opening the valves on 2 or 4 of the cylinders. A digital display on the dash, called the MPG Sentinel, would tell the driver when the change in cylinder count was in operation. Cadillac bragged that the computer could process 300,000 commands a second, and claimed fuel economy gains of 15% or more. What Cadillac didn't reveal is that they were pushing 1981 technology far beyond its limits. The software simply couldn't keep up with the demands of the job, and the end result was significant hesitations and far from smooth transitions when switching cylinders on and off, and the lack of smooth power continued when in 4 or 6 cylinder mode. Cadillac owners drove a Cadillac back then because they wanted complete isolation from the road and the engine. What they got instead was constant reminders of the engine that were so blatant it made the gimmicky MPG Sentinel a complete waste, as the car's occupants didn't need a digital readout to tell them what their behinds could easily feel. It also didn't help that the flawed engine couldn't achieve the economy savings it had claimed. The complaints from owners soon got so loud that even after 13 different programming updates to try and solve the problem, GM had no choice but to issue recalls that would effectively unplug the computer, thereby having it run as a standard V8 engine all the time. The V8 6.4 was pulled from the retail lineup for 1982, replaced by a weaker V8 to maintain better fuel economy. However, commercial vehicles, like limos that needed the stronger V8, kept it until 1984. Today, this quirky engine has a small group of followers, who apparently enjoy the challenge to improve on this technical marvel. Number 4. Chrysler TC by Maserati. Although I did a complete episode about this car about a year ago, I wanted to include it here again, not just because it was a commercial and financial failure, but why it even happened at all. The question of why can be answered with just one name, Iacocca. If you haven't heard of or seen this car before, but remember the Chrysler LeBaron convertible, you'd be forgiven for asking, isn't this TC just a modified LeBaron? In fact, when I did my LeBaron episode prior to the TC, several comments were written asking why I didn't mention the TC along with the LeBaron, because they thought it was the same car. The TC was an attempt by Lee Iacocca to bring the Chrysler brand more upscale, and it followed 2 huge successes for Chrysler, the K-Car platform and their minivans. The success of these cars allowed Chrysler to pay back their federal government bailout following their bankruptcy, and Iacocca made that turnaround happen.
Plymouth Voyager, the magic wagon.
But the K-Cars and minivans weren't exactly prestigious cars, so Iacocca teamed up with Alejandro De Tomaso, a longtime friend and head of Maserati, to build a new luxury roadster. Many execs at Chrysler thought this was a bad idea, but with so much success during his reign, no one could convince Iacocca that this TC idea wouldn't work. The TC by Maserati, with the name TC meaning turbo convertible, even though some models had a non-turbo V6, was intended to precede the third-generation LeBaron convertible, but numerous delays in the design process forced the TC to be released after the LeBaron, which cost several $1,000s less than the TC.
Get the out of the way!
Much of that cost was due to the entire production of the car taking place across 3 locations in Italy, as well as other European suppliers for some of the parts. All for a car that, when it arrived on American shores, much of the public thought was an overpriced LeBaron. Yes, the TC by Maserati had its fans, and there are still fan clubs devoted to it today, but whenever I see one, all I think of is Lee Iacocca, who, in my opinion, let his fame go to his head.
When Maserati built this new convertible, they made it everything you expect and made it exclusively for Chrysler.
I find your lack of faith disturbing.
Number 3. DeLorean DMC-12. No list of sports cars that were financial and critical failures would be complete without the one and only model ever built by the DeLorean Motor Company. Named after its founder, John Z. DeLorean, a former exec from Pontiac, who brought the famed GTO to market, this was a tale of a brilliant man who was obsessed with making his dream car, and obsessed with the fame such a car could bring.
Holy shit, you're John DeLorean, aren't you?
The DMC-12 got its name because the 12 was its originally proposed $12,000 sales price, but ironically ended up selling for more than double that. It had features which, I believe back then and still now, just existed to make it stand out from the crowd, namely its stainless steel body panels, and of course, the gull-wing doors. Both of these features hid the fact that it was powered by a very unsportscar-like French-designed 2.8-liter V6 that only made 130 horsepower. DeLorean's factory was just outside of Belfast in Northern Ireland, built with a generous loan from the British government, and was filled with generally unexperienced workers, which added to the woes that would soon follow.
This is an area of extremely high unemployment. 1 man in 3 is without work.
Production began in 1980, including a few rare models plated in 24-karat gold that would have cost $250,000 in today's dollars, as a cross-promotion with the American Express Gold Card. However, the overall lack of demand for such a quirky car led DeLorean to make a few questionable decisions to help keep his fledgling company afloat, which led him to be the target of a sting operation by the FBI for his involvement in drug trafficking. This led to bankruptcy in 1982, and production ended with only about 9,000 DeLoreans ever built. The story likely would have ended there, to be forgotten in history, if it wasn't for a certain time travel movie released in 1985
Are you telling me that you built a time machine?
that shot the car back into the public spotlight.
Out of a DeLorean?
A car which only had an 85-mile-per-hour speedometer, as were the federal requirements on all American-sold cars back then. This forced the makers of the movie Back to the Future to create a fake speedometer showing a top speed of 95, so they could show the time machine making it all the way to
88 miles per hour!
Rumor has it that John DeLorean himself was pleased to have this car featured in the movie, even though the car didn't always perform flawlessly. Number 2. Volkswagen Phaeton. Very much like the TC by Maserati, here is another example of a luxury car born from the desires of a company CEO, which resulted in an expensive lesson in misjudging what the public wants. Launched in Europe in 2002 and brought to the US by 2004, the Phaeton came from the mind of Volkswagen's then CEO, Ferdinand Piëch, to develop a luxury car that would surpass the current German market leaders, BMW and Mercedes. These companies offered down-market options to compete with Volkswagen, with cars like the Mercedes A-Class and a more compact hatchback version of the BMW 3 Series. So Volkswagen CEO figured he could move Volkswagen upmarket and beat BMW and Mercedes in the high-end luxury market. Piëch was a ruthless boss at the time, with standards so high that his underlings were forced to create the diesel emission defeat devices that would later bring VW to near financial ruin. The Phaeton was developed alongside VW partner Bentley's Continental GT and Flying Spur, and could be had with a W12 engine. That's effectively 2 V6s bolted together that made 415 horsepower. Each car was built in a dedicated factory in Dresden, Germany, and had every luxury feature imaginable for the time, with the exception of an out-of-date navigation system that was worse than the one in the cheaper Audi A8. VW wanted to offer red carpet treatment for sales and service, such as delivering customer cars to their home or work. But in the end was unable to afford to do so, meaning that the owner of a 12-cylinder Phaeton could be waiting in the same waiting room as a young kid with a VW Golf.
A Volkswagen that costs £65,000.
It was this kind of experience which led some companies to sell their luxury models under a different brand, such as Toyota selling their luxury models as Lexus, to maintain the luxury car ownership experience. But it also didn't help that the Phaeton looked like, in most American eyes, as just a more expensive Volkswagen Passat. VW could only move 1,500 Phaetons in the US for its first model year, with most of those sales going to cheaper V8 versions, some dropping in price to as low as $55,000 just to move them off the showroom floor. Even less were sold over the next 2 years, resulting in the Phaeton being pulled from the US market by 2006. Although the Phaeton lasted in other global markets for another 10 years, VW learned the hard lesson that the logo on the car made as much, if not more of a difference, for US car buyers when considering their next luxury car purchase. And to them, Volkswagen simply wasn't a luxury car.
Nice.
Before I reveal my number one pick,
We're number 2.
some of you may know that I happen to own a car that has been included on many lists just like this one. That car is the Plymouth Prowler. You may have expected that the Prowler would have been included on this list as well. Well, it's not. And not because I'm biased. Well, okay, maybe a little. But instead, being a Prowler owner since 2016, I've learned a lot about its history, and there's a lot to the story that non-owners may not know, and that history explains why so few were sold. Let me know in the comments if you would like a My Old Car episode dedicated to the Plymouth Prowler, and if I get enough requests, I'll let you know why that car really wasn't such a failure, as so many others claim. Number 1. Lincoln Blackwood. So maybe this one wasn't as big of a money loser as some others on this list, but there's a good chance that you've never seen one in person, or even knew it existed, because it failed so spectacularly. It had the shortest run of any Lincoln model ever, only one model year, and less than 3,400 were sold, making it the rarest Lincoln ever. The Blackwood was essentially a rebadged Ford F-150 pickup, made at a time when the idea of a luxury-themed pickup sounded more like a punchline than a serious idea. But just a few years earlier, Lincoln introduced the hugely successful Navigator SUV in 1998, a rebadged Ford Expedition, which itself shared many parts with the Ford F-150. Cadillac wasted no time cobbling together a rebadged Chevy Tahoe to become a Cadillac Escalade just a year later. A concept for the Blackwood was first shown to the public in 1999, and response was so strong that Ford greenlit the concept, nearly unchanged for production. To maintain the family resemblance, and likely to save on production costs, the Blackwood's front end was lifted directly from the Navigator, and its interior essentially was a Navigator as well, which in turn was an F-150 interior, but with Blackwood trim, although sadly that wood wasn't even real. No rear bench seat was available, instead only available with 2 separate rear seats, limiting the Blackwood to being a 4-passenger vehicle, and it was only available in rear-wheel drive. But the most notable feature for the Blackwood likely helped seal its fate: the standard power-operated, non-removable bed cover.
It covers a carpeted and stainless steel lined 56.3-inch long cargo space that's accessed not by a tailgate but by Dutch doors.
This very untypical bed floor, along with brushed aluminum bed sides, made the bed essentially a large trunk, and not suitable for hauling anything that a typical pickup could do. Although Lincoln had estimated sales of 18,000 per year, the Blackwood was discontinued just 15 months later. Over at Cadillac, they managed to rework the Chevy Avalanche pickup to become the Escalade EXT, which was a far bigger seller and lasted for 11 years, from 2002 to 2013. The success of the EXT is probably what led Lincoln to make a second attempt at a luxury pickup in 2005, with the Lincoln Mark LT. Although still based on the Ford F-150, the Mark LT learned from the mistakes made with the Blackwood and offered a real, non-luxury themed pickup bed. That pushed sales to over 10,000 in its first year, over 3 times what the Blackwood did in its entire run. But sales dropped each year after that, resulting in its cancellation in 2008. Today, Lincoln only sells SUVs, and it is highly unlikely they will ever try to sell a pickup again.
And I don't mean go back and reminisce or chase ghosts.
Despite how commonplace luxury pickups have become today.
I mean, take a big step back. Like go from winning an Oscar to doing a car commercial.
Thanks for watching. If you like this video, click the like button and subscribe to my channel. If you once owned a car from the 80s to mid-2000s that you rarely see today and would like it featured in a future episode, leave a reply in the comments or contact me at the email shown here. See you next time.
But there's one universal truth, and that is you never give a woman your credit card.
Right.